to officially kick us off, I'm Rain Brown. I'm Homeland Security Program Manager with the Western Region Homeland Security Council in Western Massachusetts. And this is the Cybersecurity Awareness Training Series, one of our final webinar. And the Homeland Security Councils of Massachusetts, which includes the Western region, Central, Southeast, and Northeast region, have developed this training series, which consists of online learning modules. And you can find those online learning modules on each of our websites. We'll share those websites later at the end of the webinar, so you can go and check them out. But the toolkits, the modules, are based on the CISA, the Department of Homeland Security Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. I think I got that right. I might have put in one too many words in there somewhere, but anyway, we built the online modules on their toolkits, and it kind of makes them a little more accessible. It breaks them down into sections, into really digestible units of information that you can explore and find resources to help you become more cybersecure aware. Even if you feel like you're not a cybersecurity expert, it gets you into a place where you feel like you can begin to get a sense of what to do in your town, in your organization, to begin to have a more cybersecure environment. So today we are joined by our panelists, and I'm just going to do a brief introduction of them. So we have Ron Ford, who is a cybersecurity advisor for CISA for the New England region. And he's been with CISA since 2017, well, actually since 2008, he's been there. And prior to CISA, he was in the Defense Information System Agency from 2002 and 2008. So we'd like to welcome Ron being here with us. Also, we have Seth Bouvier from, he's the Director of Cybersecurity for the Massachusetts Executive Office of Public Safety and Security. And he, prior to coming to EOPS earlier this year, he spent 10 years as Senior Advisor at the Cyber Policy in the Office of Secretary at U.S. Department of State. And we are also joined by two panelists who we didn't know were going to be with us today, and we're happy to have them. We have Stephanie Helm she's the director of the Mass Cyber Center, and we have Sam Curry from Cyber Reason, who are joining in and are going to help us out in taking a deep dive into these modules that we're going to explore today. And I just also want to thank behind the scenes helping us out today, giving us a little tech support, are my colleagues from the other Homeland Security Councils. Austin Murray, Ali Novak, and Kevin Ham are here to help out. So first, just to get a little assessment of where folks are at who are participating in today's webinar, we'd like to put up a poll just to kind of get a feel of who's the IT manager in your town. Austin, if you could put that up for us.
Rain, even I don't know that one for my own town. Yikes.
Yeah. I'm thinking in my town, if we have anybody, it's a volunteer, but
yeah.
I live in a very small town in the Berkshire Hills. We have 700 people in our town.
Wow.
Yeah.
So note to self, find out who my IT manager is for our town.
Is that everybody pretty much participated there, Austin? Does it look like?
Yep, we were holding at around 13 or 14, I think, for about 15 seconds. So I just published the results.
Okay.
So I just published the results.
Okay. Great. 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 Great.
Great.
So actually, the majority of folks have either a part-time or a full-time employee who is serving as their IT manager. And then in the chat, we also have some folks who have said that they don't know who is their IT manager. So, okay, that gives us a little bit of a sense of where we're at. And today we're going to focus on the final 3 modules of the CISA Essential Toolkit. And the chapters are called Your Surroundings, Your Data, and Your Actions Under Stress. So if you haven't had the opportunity to look at that yet or to take our online modules, Allie, can you put up in the chat the link to the PDF of the Cyber Essentials so folks can pull that up and kind of follow along if they want. I also am going to have them up on our slides. So we're going to start with Your Surroundings in the digital workplace. And the way this is going to work, I'll start off the conversation about each chapter with a question to one of our panelists, and then they can go in more deeply to each chapter and have a conversation, and we can take questions in between each chapter discussion. So if you have a question that comes to you while we're talking, feel free to either put it into the chat directly or send it to Kevin. He's going to be gathering questions if you don't feel like putting it directly into the chat for everybody, and we'll share those back with the panelists at the end of each module discussion. So again, our first module is Your Surroundings. And Seth, I thought I'd start with a question to you about how would I begin to assess who should have what level of access to the network and who of outside vendors should have access? And then, and who should I include in my town? Who should I include in that conversation of that determining that level of access?
Sure. And before I start, I just want to say thank you to Rain and to the other Homeland Security Advisory Councils for putting this program on. I think it's been really helpful, or hopefully others have agreed it's been helpful. And thanks to CISA and Ron and your many colleagues there for putting together these cyber essentials. I think it really distills a lot of kind of maybe demystifies a little bit and kind of creates these kind of bite-sized snackable versions of what's a pretty tricky challenge, and kind of to orient people into the right directions. And so thanks to everyone for all that. I would just say, even before getting to the kind of nitty-gritty of your question, Rain, I think the big picture may be helpful to kind of take a step back and think about the big picture. And this one, I think, kind of relates to some of what we talked about last time as well, in terms of knowing what kind of applications are on your network. This one, to me, is kind of knowing who is on your network. And so even before you make kind of complicated decisions about this person's in, this person's out, I think, taking a step back and having an inventory and understanding who's on your system, especially now in this COVID time where everyone's working remotely, kind of the infrastructure that's on your network is going to be really tightly correlated with identities and who's on your network, whose mobile phone is on your network. You've got laptops and iPads, potentially other kinds of devices. Just really having a good sense for what's on your network and kind of who, in terms of the identity senses on your network, I think is probably the first step. And I would say that's the way to think about this module before you start thinking about kind of decisions about who's going to be in and who's going to be out. In terms of those decisions, I think, of course, it's always going to be kind of risk-based and case by case, but the essentials module, the way that I kind of look at it, the takeaway is giving you the tools to be able to make those decisions, and the collections of resources, I think, are quite helpful. But starting with the inventory, I think, is probably the first step.
Yeah, I'd add on to that, Seth, that in kind of adding on to the previous webinar as well, where everything is a process, right? It's you're taking steps to ensure that your environment is secure. And I think in this breakdown, in terms of your surroundings and actually taking into account what's residing on your network, who's residing on your network, and ensuring that you have a process, whether it's a small process and you have, a very simplistic spreadsheet, or you have a platform that you're able to leverage. I think it's important for whatever environment that you're in that you're able to actively manage your environment. So again, looking at the systems that are on board, what's deployed, taking a look at what are people's roles. You can break people's, your groups of employees and staff either down by role or by discretion based on the need. So I think it's really important to take all that into account, regardless of how big or how small your environment is just really supplanting the fact that you do need some type of process or plan in order to really manage your surroundings. So I know we start to bleed over into the physical environment, and that's also really important. Who has access to your buildings, who has access via third-party vendors. That all takes a lot of time and energy and effort that I think it's really important to the overall security of the environment. So, it's a lot to think about, right? Whether you are an IT manager in your town and you have different entities that you have to keep track of, whether it's the utility people, or whether it's a third party outsourcer who comes by every so often to gain access to your system just to do a check to see if everything is still working properly. That all takes a lot of management and effort, to a certain extent. So I think it's really important to keep that in perspective as we continue to evolve in this digital workspace and even in our digital personal lives, is that we really have to keep track of those things and be active in terms of having the awareness and looking at at the end of the day, especially in this environment where everything overlaps, where your office life and your home life overlap. For me, that's happening right at this second. It's really important to keep that in mind about what am I doing, both from my professional standpoint as well as my kids in the other room who are also accessing the same resources that I am. We have to just continually actively manage this.
Raina, I'd love to chime in here. I think it's important to identify a few things. First of all, do you have any super users, and does everybody need to have that kind of privilege? Like, do people need root or administrator access? And limit that group of people, because they're the highway right through the town, right? So if somebody grabs one of them, they can effectively explore to their heart's content, and they're the most anomalous users anyway, the ones who really use it. So it's easy to hide in their tracks. So I would say do a who's got super user access and limit that to the people who need it to do the support function. Do keep in mind that many of the IT departments grew because people did it themselves. We would call that rogue IT now, but no, that was some IT when it started, right? So it can be a bit of a cultural adaptation. The second thing is think about the classes of data that you have, how do you watch for those? Maybe limit the systems that they're on. Maybe limit the people who can access those systems. Don't try to do it for everything to start. Pick the most sensitive classes of data and make sure that those are relatively safe and backed up. And something that I'm advocating with CISOs of all stripes, or Chief Information Security Officers, but it would apply to any executive, is if you have responsibility for the strategy, try to get to an internet cafe style approach where you assume the network you're connecting over is compromised. Effectively, it's a business decision whether you adopt any service or solution. And that should be where you're saying, well, where's our data going to be and do we accept it? But, try not to have it sitting on hard drives and distributed in Excel files. Use, commercially viable cloud services that you can have conversations about security and risk with, and try to reduce the footprint as much as possible. And this is all a continuum. You don't have to get it perfect. You just have to start the journey, and you have tremendous reductions in risk right up front. If you take this philosophy, by the way, you will become more resilient, not completely, but more resilient to things like ransomware and to abuse. And when leaks happen, it will spread less, right? I mean, you don't have a breach that suddenly it's catastrophe because everything is out and you can't account for anything. You want to be able to contain it. This notion of anti-fragility and resilience, being able to bounce back. Those are super important, but crawl, walk, run. So get those super users under control, know the classes data you care about, try not to have a proliferation of that data and keep it in certain places if you can.
And I would just echo, as Ron said, this is a process. We talk about cybersecurity as people, process, and technology. This is a process that is well within your purview to control. So understanding what your network looks like and then who has access to that, and don't overlook the physical aspect that was brought up. And when somebody needs access, I think is what Sam was saying, is just because they need access to some data does not give them a privilege to look at everything. So this is a time to have a conversation about what does your architecture look like, and can you segregate really sensitive data someplace else so that people who need different kinds of data can get to that without compromising or being able to transfer through. And I think this is an important component when we discuss third-party risk, because the third-party risk really is you are giving a third party access to sensitive information you have or to your network. Do you understand where they're going when they get there? Have you confined their or limited their access? So that's just an important component of something we've talked about previously.
Rain, before we move on, I just want to make sure we mentioned multi-factor authentication. Nobody else, I don't think anyone brought it up. That's part of the essential toolkit for this module. So I think we should just foot stomp that a little bit. I think that's a really important step that you can take. It's a little bit, it's related, but of course it's about making sure that people are trying to connect to your network are who they say they are, and implementing multi-factor authentication can be really impactful. And so if organizations haven't done that, they should definitely take a look at that.
Yeah, and I had a question kind of along those lines, Seth, with the multi-factor authentication was what, along with that, how about managing passwords? Like I know like there's recently with some work that I was doing with some small towns in my region here, we were doing an assessment, and one of the employees is responsible for a lot of different things. And getting into a lot of different systems at the town, that person themselves is managing more than 30 passwords. And it's like, how do you manage that and manage it safely, and like not just have them all written down somewhere right next to your desk so that you remember them and whoever needs them can get them, So I'll kick that off to Ron or Seth to start us off.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I mean there's a fairly straightforward way. There are lots of different password managers out there today. I mean, I can't keep track of the amount of different accounts that I have. I'm fortunate that I've signed up for one of the free versions of password managers out and about, but there are more options today than there were 3 or 5 years ago. I can't professionally mention any of them, but you can do a internet search, and there are a lot of fairly robust options out there that it just takes a little bit of time. Again, looking back at as Stephanie mentioned, earlier about the process, this is all a process. If you take the time to account for your different accounts that you have access to, if Rain, one of your team members has over, you said 30 different email accounts or active accounts.
Yeah.
I would encourage them to find a password manager today. It's sign up is free generally. There are definitely different options, for different features if you want to pay for, an enhanced account. But 5 minutes of internet searching will, I think, result in definitely some interesting options for keeping track of your passwords. Nowadays, if you run certain password managers, they also have add-ons to your internet browser, so that when you go to log on to one of your websites or your internal portal websites, that it automatically, if you give it the option, it will auto-populate your username and password. So you don't have to go in and log into your password manager site. It will automatically populate there, so you don't need to remember the password that you need to get the password for to log in. So
Rain, can I add something to that? I mean, you can say no. The difficulty sometimes when you do a search, so I can actually recommend names because I don't work for the government, but I won't here out of common courtesy. So feel free to write to me because I don't have any affiliation with any of them, but ask a friend. Like, be super careful when you Google that there's some malware out there and there are some services that are posing as password managers. The only thing I would do a little differently advice is I would recommend paying, right? It's not super expensive. It's usually a one-time fee. Sometimes it's a subscription fee. And there's various flavors, but like, just do a little background check on the company, and realize that people may be trying to inject themselves in there. I just checked my own password manager. I have 493 passwords. There's no way I could manage them properly otherwise. It's a good idea to vet one for the town and say, here's one we approve of, so that people can go and do that. The other thing is, don't abuse them, and be super careful. I have seen organizations that say, this is such a good idea, we're going to have a common password vault that we're all going to use, which means now that one password that's used to access all the others is 40 people use it, which means it becomes easier to break highway for the bad guys to get all those passwords. So you're sort of defeating it. Encourage proper use of the password manager as it's designed. If you need a multi-user one, look for one of those, because they have them as well, right? So that everyone can go into a common pool. So don't abuse it. Look for advice, and really, really, really make that front-end password secure. Super important.
The other thing just to say about passwords quickly before we move on is, every time you hear about a company that has a big data breach, that the passwords are out in the wild, and so you can look and because we all have passwords at a lot of companies, you can do a little research and figure out which ones have been compromised, and you should never use that password for anything, and change your passwords. So just a little bit of due diligence on your own end to kind of make sure that the passwords you're using haven't been compromised. That information's out there, so I don't have like the website to throw out there, but you can find it pretty easily. And then just to foot stomp the multi-factor piece again, that does help with a little bit of this, because if someone's trying to use your password that they've cracked somehow or gotten off the dark web or whatever it is, that does protect you a little bit. So not false confidence. You shouldn't have weak passwords and multi-factor. You should have both, but that those things are related.
Thank you all. And I'd like to open it up for questions right now for this module regarding your surroundings. So if anybody has any questions, they either want to put in the chat, or if somebody wants to go ahead and unmute themselves and ask a question, or Kevin, if you've received any questions that you want to put into the group.
Yeah, I'll ask one. This is Kevin. You guys talked a lot about different things you can do when allowing people access to your network. What about when an employee leaves? We always want to assume that when someone leaves, it's going to be on great terms, and maybe it is on great terms, but what if their terms aren't that great, or you just want to be safe? What are some practices to make sure that there aren't, vulnerabilities left after an employee or someone leaves the organization?
I think that's a great time to do an audit. You obviously don't want to leave any unnecessary permissions or accounts enabled after an employee leaves or even transitions to a new role. I think it's a great time to reassess those permissions and disable and deactivate when necessary. When appropriate, those certain levels of access and permission. I find that just in my experience, it's always when I ask these questions of some of my stakeholders, the typical response is, they do it on an as needed basis. And I think that's because they have other priorities that they have to tend to. So it's all about risk management. What's the likelihood that, an employee, whether disgruntled or not disgruntled, might try to reaccess, some of the systems to do some nefarious activity, such as downloading, information that they shouldn't have, or, the days up to the point where, they're separating from, the company or the organization. I think that's a great time to either, start to monitor some of their activity, as well as doing some level of additional monitoring, turn on the audit logs. Those are some key things I think that will help to reduce the likelihood that there will be some level of abnormal activity. But I think it's a good time when you have people who are offboarding to do those audit checks as well.
I would do them regularly. I would do them on a cycle, and if it's too much, because it's not fun, I would pick a subset and do that every 30 days, or do all of them every 90 days. The least privilege principle saves you pain in the deprovisioning gap, right? So, rather than have to do a monumental search, Ron's right, you should, but it's much easier if you've been trimming people's access as they go. People think of the entitlements they've accumulated as things that are theirs, but if they're not using it and don't need it, shut it down, and do that in an ongoing way.
Great, thank you. Any other questions there, Kevin, or are we ready to move on to our next module?
I think we can move on.
Great. All right. The next module is about your data, making backups and avoiding loss of information critical to operations. And Ron, one of the questions that we'd like to kind of explore with this topic is, how should small and medium-sized municipalities go about developing resiliency plans, such as they do with their disaster recovery plans and business contingency plans, when facing limitations in workforce funding and professional development?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, I try to leverage processes as much as possible. So when you are thinking of doing it yourself, I know that there are organizations and entities that do outsourcing, they do cloud services. So if you are managing this on site and on premises, that means that you typically would have someone who's dedicated to doing this for you, or as a part of their role. I like what Sam said, doing it on a schedule, backing up your data, your configurations on a schedule. And then, at certain points during the time of the year, making sure that you build it into a plan that you're able to exercise some level of backup, some type of restoration. I think for the group that we're in, the circle that we kind of revolve around, we're used to the tabletop exercises, right? We're used to going through that discussion about, what are the steps that we need to take in order for us to continue to support the restoration of services and restoration of data. But there's also a great time, opportunity for organizations to also do functional exercises to actually see how well those processes work, to do the switchover, to replicate, to actually go back and see, what does the actual contingency plan really detail in terms of, here's the last known good, date of our data being stored. Let's actually go through that process and try not to impact the actual, live environment, to a certain extent. But, when you're talking about contingency plans, when you are a small or a small town, you have to look at what's the overall contingency plan of the town itself, in terms of emergency response. And I think this is, where Seth and Stephanie can also chime in as well, is how do you incorporate something such as IT restoration and services into your overall emergency response plan? Is it something separate, or is it something that you can incorporate into your overall emergency response plan? So again, it goes back to a process. Do you have the ability? Do you have the capacity to develop a plan? And if you do, is it a part of a much greater plan that you can either pull out and exercise yourself, or is it something that you need to have multiple people involved in so that you can run through this entire simulation when there is a time, when you set that time down?
Thank you. And Stephanie, do you want to speak to the information you put into the chat?
I could hardly wait. So many of you have already participated in the cybersecurity incident response plan workshops that Mass Cyber Center hosted over the summer. If you have not heard of them, which I have run into people who have not heard of them, I put a link in the chat, and that will get you to the Mass Cyber Center website, and under municipalities, under the toolkit, you'll find information about the workshops that we held. I come from the Navy, and in the Navy, you're always talking about planning, and you're always talking about having a plan. I would say, in terms of incident response for cybersecurity, it's the planning process that will help you the most. Yes, it would be nice if you have an incident to take a plan off the shelf, open it up, and just execute it. A lot of times you don't know all of the different components of a situation, and you might not have everything in the plan, but the planning process is very important. It allows you to build a team. It allows you to think about what you need to protect. We've already talked about that in this webinar series about you can't protect and you cannot defend what you don't know you have. So doing all of that in advance of an incident is very important. And so there's some step-by-steps here that are basic. To Ron's point, you can talk about a cyber incident response plan, but when you're in a big event that is cyber-based, many of the effects will not just be on the computer. It may be a physical side effect. You may be experiencing electrical outages. You may have a problem with water. So to Ron's point, ensuring that whatever you're thinking about that might be an incident that is coming from a cyber incident needs to be integrated across your municipality with other response, so that you can get public safety involved, so that you can get the lawyer involved, so that you can get your finance people involved if that's necessary to do a full-scale response action. So I think that's very important to think ahead of time about what you would do if you don't know anything about cyber and what an incident might do to your municipality. I highly recommend thinking about it before you have the incident, because you've got some time to ask questions, build a team, get more information.
I would add, or rather I would emphasize test, like if you've set up a plan, you don't have to involve a lot, but test your readiness, do a tabletop, and consider as well two conditions that follow on from what both Ron and Stephanie said, which is one, what do you do when even your backup fails? Are you prepared for that, right? And two is if like ransomware hits you and it's also in your backup, which can happen, what are your contingencies? What do you do when even that has failed? So as Stephanie said, you don't want to be thinking about it during the incident. You want to have thought about it and go, look, I don't want to, but here's my really worst case scenario, that you have done that advanced thinking, because with the adrenaline of fight or flight and having to explain to very irate electorate and officials and businesses and schools what the heck is going on, it's very hard to think straight under those circumstances. So if you've gamed it out and have some prep, you're in a much better place.
Did you want to add anything into that, Seth?
I would just say we kind of jump to the have a plan, which I don't really have anything to add to that at this point, but in the module itself, I would just say, don't, in addition to that, look at some of the actions that are put out there. Then I would just emphasize a couple. One is really about having an inventory of the data, and in particular, the data that's the most critical for your operations and for, or maybe most sensitive too, could be sort of part of that. But essentially, what are the data that are most important in terms of your organization or your town functioning, and prioritize that. The other thing that I would kind of throw into the mix here is there are some, I think, low to no cost resources that are indicated in there, things that can potentially help you. Specifically, there's a couple of organizations that have ransomware toolkits and playbooks that are worth looking at. Some things that like domain filtering, which I don't think we need to really get into here, but have been estimated to protect against some types of ransomware attacks, and are sort of worth putting into your operations. They're of course not a substitute. You can do everything right. There's not a substitute for having a plan when things go wrong. So I wouldn't say it supersedes any of that, but just before we move on, I kind of want to make sure that we do flag some of those things, which I think are potentially quite useful and helpful.
Thank you for pointing those out. And one of the questions that I was thinking of asking too is, and Sam kind of picked up on part of this, is should you think of backing up your backups, and what level of security should you have at each level of backup?
Are you asking me? I'm happy to respond. I don't know if it's going to be a super savvy response, but I would just say, like, a lot of things is going to just to be situation and context dependent on what the data are and how critical they are. But you can have off-site backups. You can provide for physical security of your backups. I mean, there are a lot of choices, but I think every organization kind of just needs to take a realistic look at what they actually have. And then this kind of goes hand in hand with the plan, right? If you have a plan for what you're going to do in these eventualities, I think you kind of have a better sense for what kind of steps you need to take to protect the data, and which ones are kind of you can live with it or mitigate as circumstances depend.
Rain, I would say you should do a triage exercise for what to recover first as part of a recovery plan. That which services are required for public safety first, for continuity of service. Make sure you know the order of those, and it is different. Recovering and being back online is different from being back to full productivity, and that's different from having all your data back. And so you can test parts of that system, but you should put some thought into, okay, what comes back first, what comes back second, what comes back third, because if you're figuring it out in the moment, you may make some poor choices. And somebody might say, well, why would you have restored, this department rather than police department at this time? These are tough questions. So do put some thought into that ahead of time.
And if I could add just one more thing, I like what Seth said earlier, regarding how to manage this kind of comprehensively, whether it's your data or your surroundings, is taking this by small bites, with the Essentials Toolkit. Again, this is to help break down the barriers that people might have regarding understanding what are they supposed to do. It can all seem probably pretty overwhelming, and paralyzing to a certain extent, because if you're a small town and your resources are constrained, the last thing that you want to do is to possibly have to add on some type of solution where that you have a limited budget and you're basically stretched thinly, and you're having to manage multiple things. So this is a way for those town and municipalities to have a way to really chunk through some of these, what I think we are really trying to identify, some fairly straightforward suggestions and recommendations on how you all can, again, be more resilient, be more aware of the risk associated with using technology and those solutions to make the towns run more efficiently, to help businesses, be more productive. These are all things that I think, comprehensively can be a bit daunting, but I'm hopeful that with the essentials and with these webinars, that people are taking away from this that they can do this, and that they should have some comfort in that if you're attending these webinars, that you are taking some major steps to understanding what are the risks associated with your organization and your towns.
I have one more piece of advice, which is keep the logs. Right, backing up and recovering. We're used to thinking, okay, the lights were on, they went off, we came back. And if you can make that time approach zero, you're doing a pretty good job, right? That you've been available throughout. But security is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So that strategy will get you the availability. You still got to say, so what did the bad guys do when the lights were out? And what were the decisions we made post facto so we can learn from them? And so it's also about keeping good records during the crisis and making sure that you can always access the files later and say, let's rebuild what happened. Did we have a breach? Didn't we have a breach? We have no idea. In some cases, you have to default assuming you did. No one wants to do that, right? So if you had an outage, something happened, a disaster scenario, and then you came back, you want to preserve and collect the evidence and the data around what happened.
If I could add one thing, I worked in the wargaming department for a while at the War College in Newport. And one thing that we did that kind of drove people crazy, but I do think it's worth mentioning here, is you don't have to tabletop everything from the beginning to the end and make it the event so comprehensive that it takes a really long time. It's back to what Ron said, take a chunk of what you can do. In some cases, you want to look at a tabletop that says, when we first think there's something wrong, do we have enough of a response plan in place? And let that be it. Like, you're only looking at the first, 24 hours of an event. But then to Sam's point, we want to think about, once we recover, what's our process in place to evaluate how we can close the barn door, or that we can identify where we went wrong, or our backups were not sufficient. And so we need to take an extra step on that. You can take a little timeline that said, bad thing happened. What did we do here? And then 2 days later, what did we do here? And then 4 days later, this is what we needed to do. And then build a scenario that basically tells everybody, we went through that, we went through that, we went through that. Now we're doing this part of it. I think putting something on the calendar, maybe every 3 months, that says we're going to take an hour and a half and we're going to do a quick tabletop on just one aspect of that, can help you figure out where you are in your planning process, what you should do about backups, and look more holistically. I think that might be helpful to people rather than try to do one whole big tabletop. When you talk about backups for backups, you can be guaranteed that the ransomware hackers know that one way people are not paying is that they've got a backup. And so now they're thinking about, well, where are those backups? And if it's really a lucrative target that they want to go after, they may not, be happy just to do a ransomware. They may be looking at where your backups are and see if they can get to that so that they can assure themselves that you will write the check. So it is worth kind of walking through the whole process end to end to see if you're as mature as you think you would like to be.
Thank you all for that. That was a really great conversation. And as you were talking there, Stephanie, about setting a schedule of having just little tabletop exercise, I felt myself think, oh, then that actually just sets up the culture of we're cyber aware. It establishes that that's part of what we do in our town or organization.
Yeah, I'm probably one of the few people that wants to do a whole day of cybersecurity, right? I know everybody else is looking at, I'm happy to do this because this is like taking my medicine or going to the gym. I know I need to do something. If you can put it on the calendar for a reasonable amount of time, periodically, because what you're doing then is you're building on everybody's experience and the education that everybody gets in the event, but make it very focused. I think people are more willing to tolerate that. And that does create that culture of, okay, it's time to do a cyber thing, but we're going to be done with this in 90 minutes, so.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Kevin, did we have any questions come through, or is there anybody in the audience that would like to go ahead and unmute and ask a question?
Yeah, I'll give the audience here a second here, but then I've got one. So this is a question I've seen asked a lot, and I suspect the answers are going to vary, but should you pay a ransomware? Is that going to guarantee you get your data back if you don't have a good backup?
Who wants to take it first?
Go Ron.
You unmuted first. You have to.
I know. I unmute first. The federal government's perspective on this is that you should not pay the ransom. There is no guarantee whatsoever that you will have full access to your data, that the bad actors will be out of your network and out of your systems. You have zero trust with the ransom, being actually you giving the right key, the decryption key. So there are so many risks associated with you trying to pay. That's why we, through this entire conversation that we've been having today, is talking about the processes, establishing those processes, establishing, the proper amount of tabletop exercises so that it will help to reduce your chance that if you are a victim of a ransomware attack, that the scope is limited to the impact of that ransomware attack. Hopefully, if you've, done some of the homework, if you've done the logging, if you've done the inventory, and asset management, if you've done the tabletop exercises. So long story short is we recommend that you do not pay the ransom.
I'm gonna. Go ahead, Seth. No, you go first.
Okay, just two quick things. One, I think Ron mentioned this, but as you're making this decision, obviously, the recommendation from the government is not to pay. I would just say two things to keep in mind. One is, even if you do get a key, it's probably not going to decrypt. You're probably not going to get 100% of what you want, of everything back, right? So the best case scenario you should just keep in mind is not necessarily 100% everything gets back. The other is you should probably not make this decision by yourself. One example is, sometimes the FBI has keys available. So just don't make the decision by yourself. There's other stakeholders that you should presumably reach out to, including law enforcement. If you have an insurance company, that would be one as well. So don't just make this decision.
I would say the law is changing. New York State had 2 laws, for instance, that were looking at criminalizing paying ransoms. In the Senate, they didn't go through, at least not yet. Also, the federal government has a list of entities that you shouldn't pay. It amounts to racketeering or supporting terrorism and what have you. So I would build on what Seth said and say, make sure there's a lawyer in the know that you know who to reach out to, find out who that is now. That also not paying doesn't make you immune to civil charges either. So you've got a risk-based decision in the moment to make. We've seen in healthcare a death now in Washington State, and we've seen horrible damage done in places like Dusseldorf due to ransomware. If you have something like a nuclear power plant and you want to shut it down and you can't because things are under ransom, these are very different risk equations. Probably not what you're facing in most municipalities, but in the moment, know who you're going to call to get legal advice, to know, because it is changing fast enough that if you prepare today, in 6 months, it might not be the same legal landscape. And you should have a lawyer on call.
Yeah, the lawyer is an important component of what we had in our response planning. And the other component that I really was not prepared for that came out in the workshops is your cybersecurity insurance broker. If you have a policy, they probably have an opinion about how to approach ransomware. And so no matter what any of us say, they're going to be part of your equation. And this is at the highest levels of your municipality to make that decision. I would say the insurance company does usually have access to people who have been experienced with ransomware situations and would give you factual information. They even have people that are, good at negotiating. But the thing that I've heard is, once the ransomware people hear that you're negotiating, they think that you're going to pay. So they're pretty confident that you're doing that. I would just say you're only encouraging this kind of bad behavior if you pay. And it's easy for us to say that when it's not our data in our operation, or if it's a healthcare issue, lives at risk, but it just doesn't help anybody to pay.
Something else, cyber insurance is not a substitute for what Ron was talking about. Super important, because if you look at public filings by municipalities and corporations, the amount of insurance people are buying is growing in response to ransomware, while the spend in cyber is not growing as fast. What that says is some people are saying, yes, we need more insurance, but some are saying we'll do that instead. And so you really, really, really want to look at your contracts with your cyber insurance provider and check the exclusions out. Make sure that you are not gambling on something that's going to go away. If it says in there that you should have a reasonable cyber program, and you should have backups, and you should have resilience, and you should test them, right? Because they're all a little different, but they have a common template. Then you better have those, or the money won't be there when you go to pay that ransom, or to cover your damages, or to make people whole. So really pay attention when you're talking to your broker, and now go read those exclusions.
Thank you all for that. That was a great discussion from that question. So we're going to move on now to our final module, and that is your actions under stress. which is fun for
Did I
all
ruin
of us.
that earlier? Did I ruin that
Yeah.
when I talked about adrenaline? Ooh.
No, we can just keep building on that, you know? We can let the adrenaline keep flowing. So, Stephanie, I think I'd like to start this question for you. And we've been talking about how important practicing through training and exercises are, and how that helps build preparedness and resilience. Are there resources available for towns to conduct their own exercises, or, when should they think about getting outside help to pull together an exercise? How do you just manage that?
Sometimes, my understanding is, for like first responders and public safety, there's a schedule of exercises that folks go through, and right, that makes sense, because you need to understand incident response and communications and all the other procedures that go into a response. I am not aware that we have integrated a cyber incident response as part of that sort of first responder training. And I think that's probably something that we should consider, the royal we of the Commonwealth should consider to do, because I think, as I said, a major cyber incident is likely to have some component that would bleed out into a secondary response. So you're going to have the cyber incident response, and then you're going to have, and how do we make sure people don't freeze, or that traffic lights don't cause accidents, and depending on what all those things are, it's related, but it's not the same. If you're talking strictly about cyber incident response training, if you look at the PowerPoint in workshop 2 on our website, there is this one slide that says, good morning, an employee starts reporting this. Now, what do you do? It's a brief setup, and it doesn't take much more than that to really get people to kind of think through, what would I do if I got that call, and who would I call? And is that reflected in our plan? So you can do something as simple as that. And as I said earlier, if you can put it on your calendar, you don't have to have dramatic, complicated scenarios. You can just sort of walk through, well, we've gotten to this point. Now, what would we do? And now what would we do really can be a good conversation starter and an exercise to do that. I think that's one thing that I'm looking for. We have run in the Cyber Resilient Massachusetts working group, we've run a couple of exercises to look at particular aspects. But I think, and I know Cyber Yankee is an exercise that the National Guard runs. I think it would behoove us to try to think about ways to integrate a training exercise with the cyber component in it. So I think that's just something I would put on my aspirational list of things to do for what we want to do for resiliency. If you're a police officer or you're a fire person, you have to train in order to keep your response actions sharp, and you have to be aware of new procedures so that you can be the best you can possibly be. And I don't think cyber is any different. We just need to integrate that into the culture that we have.
Hey, yeah, I think a couple things I would probably add on. And again, these are all topics that are related. They overlap. You can't do one thing without the other, in terms of accounting for your assets, the data, your surroundings. That all builds up to the point where you are running through some type of exercise, right? And the point of the whole exercise is to determine your action under stress. So again, I like what Stephanie said earlier about setting a time, sometimes during the year to go through a simulation. If emergency responders do it, and I think the caveat there is emergency responders, they're the majority of their time is spent on triage, right? They're doing all these different types of performing different roles and services, but all with the intent of triaging the situation and making sure that, from a public safety standpoint, that the person doesn't go into any severe crisis, at that point. They can help to mitigate that. I think if you look at it in terms of cyber incident crisis management, you have to give some caveats to that. There are third-party vendors who are out there that can help you through these times as well. There are the working groups that Stephanie hosts and manages that brings us all together so that we can all talk, to the same taxonomy. But I think, going back to what Stephanie said earlier about, what are some of the things that you can do? You should absolutely, if you're a small or medium-sized town or municipality, you have to sit down and dedicate some time to this. Talk about what are those high-value assets, as Sam said earlier. What are those crown jewels that if you were to have some type of disruption, whether it is of malicious intent or it's a backhoe cutting the fiber, which happens every single day somewhere, even in the Commonwealth, you should have the awareness to document what that process is, so that when you are under stress, that again, the extent of the damage is hopefully reduced, and that this is not something that you're just experiencing for the first time. The stress. When you are going through times of distress, your body, your mind reacts, in certain ways, whether it's in an adverse way or it's, falling back on the muscle memory that you've built in your mind that you can fall back to a process. So again, ensuring that you have these plans, have a process down, taking the time. I love the fact that if you can take an hour, out of the week or out of the month to bring everyone together who has a role to play in your response activities, that's a great opportunity for you to all sit down, exchange thoughts and ideas, put them down on paper, so that when you do have some live fire event that's happening, that's not the first time that you're making those calls or sending those messages out for people to respond.
If I could just add one thing about when you train or you exercise, the training audience is usually expected to meet a standard and follow a procedure. In many cases, we haven't defined all of those processes yet. When we're talking about people don't even have a plan, it's very difficult to have a training exercise and look at the training audience and then evaluate them. So this is the crawl, walk, run, I think, that needs to be integrated in our thinking. Is if you don't have a plan yet, running a full-scale exercise to evaluate people is unrealistic because you haven't set the standards and you don't know what people are training to. So we do need to have the plan in place in order to evaluate, in order to set the standards, in order to set the expectations.
Rain, can I just mention two points really pretty quickly? One is, in my opinion, this module is a little different than the other ones, in the sense that the other ones had these really kind of discrete one-off actions that you can take to improve your cybersecurity, whereas this one's a little bit more, you got to roll up your sleeves, and it's kind of an ongoing. I mean, they're all ongoing, but this is just a little different than the others. And so in that context, I wanted to just make sure that, and people understand that these aren't in order where you've done the other 5 and then you get to this one and then you start. I think because it's a little different and it might even feel more advanced in some sense, but this one goes with the other ones in the sense that you need to start the planning at the same time that you're doing these other things. And so I just wanted to kind of throw that out there, because it's not like this is step 6 of a 6-step process. These are all kind of, they go together and they fit together. you'll get more out of it if you're planning while you're taking these other actions.
I do want to chime in just with one thing, something Ron and Stephanie both alluded to, that tabletopping can't be underestimated. I have been through breaches that got to the horrible place. And in my first two, I was surprised that I wasn't the star. And what I mean by that is up until the incident, it was like, oh yeah, security is Sam's problem, security is Sam's problem, right? And then during the incident, no, I was on the private sector side. It was the CEO and the chief counsel took over. And I realized my mission was not what I thought it was. My mission was not to own it and field everything and be the quarterback. My mission was instead to get true answers, to know what decisions have to be resolved, and to force right action. And I've since learned in every organization I've been in, it's going to be a different set of reflexes for what that inner group is. And you probably aren't in it if you weren't there from the beginning. And so what are you going to do when town officials are getting calls from citizens, from the press? What if it's election time? They need to be seen to be in control to some degree, and they will be. They're the folks that are in charge. So my advice is the tabletopping, first of all, makes them have a sense of participation. It also gives you an inkling as to how decisions will be made, where authority lies. And very important is make them realistic, make them visceral in some ways. If you've got them sitting down, you will bond doing this. You will find where the friction is, but come up with a scenario that say you can actually game out and say, all right, folks, all the lights have gone out in town. Somebody's defaced a website that is hosted by a provider, and it happens to be a week before an election. Like, start with that scenario. Get them immersed in it. And the closer they feel immersed in it, even if, as Stephanie said, it's just a discrete portion that you're testing, or if you're testing not even with the officials themselves or whoever the authority might be, the more realistic it is, the more you're going to get to what you need to know, and the more they're going to start to build the reflexes to support you.
Thank you all for that. Some really great points there. And I had Wayne contacted me via the chat that he had a comment and a question. And Wayne, if you still have that and you'd like to unmute yourself, go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. First, I'd like to, I've met Stephanie a couple times at meetings before and had some good conversations with her, and I've talked to Rain several times. I want to thank you guys for doing this kind of thing. I think I may have run into Ron once. Those two folks may know that I have a long background in IT, 40 years, and I think it's important what you're doing. I think it's also important for people to understand that it's a long haul process, that you're not going to solve all these problems by any stretch of the imagination in a short time frame. I also think, and I don't know the audience that you're speaking to other than myself and the two people I mentioned, but some of the things you're saying may be a fair amount over people's heads and may leave them a little bit scratching their heads about what you mean by what you're saying. So I think it might be beneficial to try and take out the lingo and talk more in plain English when you're having these. That said, in the emergency management world, there's actually resources and money available for emergencies and for planning. There doesn't seem to be that capability available for hardening IT infrastructure that I've seen. So I don't know if you guys can talk about that either at a future time, because it doesn't, while it seems to be a priority to discuss, it doesn't seem to be a priority by the state or the federal government to provide money to do these things, money and resources to do these things. The other thing I'd say is we cannot forget to remind people of the mundane. There was a good comment by somebody about what your insurance covers and doesn't cover, and whether or not you're thinking of one thing as a solution because you have insurance for not doing other things. But the easy thing, there's a lot of easy things to do. You got to make sure your hardware and software gets regular updates. You got to make sure your firewalls are updated. Yeah, not only the hardware, but the software. You got to make sure your VPN connections are taken care of. And to that point, it also means if you have people connecting to your networks, I don't mean employees, but general population or even third-party vendors connecting to your networks, you're kind of leaving yourself wide open unless you're, and I hate to say this, but also understanding what the environment is on their own personal computers. Much of these are very, very out-of-date systems. I've seen many of them without any antivirus or malware software, without any hardware or software updates for years. So that's kind of where I'm at. So I don't know if anybody wants to comment on any of those. I'm sure I may have missed things because I haven't attended all of these. Hi,
Yeah.
Stephanie.
Hi, Wayne. I would say when you talk about larger, broader IT architectures, EOTSS recognizes that, and they have made some money available last year for grants for cybersecurity training for municipalities, and they're hopeful, depending on how the budget lands, because everybody's kind of in an uncertain funding environment right now, for the FY21 to continue that. And additionally, I would point people to the Community Compact grant program and Division of Local Services. Sean Cronin works with EOTSS to evaluate applications from municipalities, because you're right, Wayne, in some cases we're talking about it's an architecture that needs to be improved in order to take the first major step in plugging some of the holes for a cyber vulnerability. So that is recognized, and I think everybody's kind of waiting to see what the budget situation looks like, but I would keep an eye on Community Compact. I do know they've favorably looked at applications that talk broadly about IT architectures that include a component that talk about cybersecurity.
Okay, I've done a lot with Community Compact stuff, but I've never seen anything accepted about cybersecurity. They're always looking for new and novel things to do, but not for the mundane infrastructure things. That's been my experience. And I do know Sean, so, and I've worked with him in the past.
Yeah, and Mike Hamill left, but the interim is Kathy Marks, so I can get her information to you if you need it.
Sure, thanks.
Anyone else want to respond to anything from Wayne's comments?
Yeah, I think Wayne, this is Ron. You made some really valid comments about funding and resources, especially looking at it from a federal perspective. I believe you're aware of the Homeland Security grants that are available to the state governments and into municipalities. That all gets divvied up based on, I believe it's the state and how they prioritize those funds. But in addition to that, if you've ever participated in the National Cybersecurity Review, it's hosted on the MSISAC's web page. So that's the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center. It's a nonprofit organization that's funded by DHS and the MSISAC through the Center of Internet Security, who's the larger organization. They actually host what's called the National Cybersecurity Review, and essentially it's a no-cost annual self-assessment that helps us as a federal government writ large help to gauge the capabilities as well as the gaps of state and local and tribal and territorial governments' cybersecurity programs. So that helps to feed into how we can help to benchmark how we should, ultimately, reprioritize, reallocate, resources and funds possibly. So that's another way for the federal government and DHS and ultimately Congress to help to gauge what is the overall cybersecurity posture of the nation. So, if you're interested in learning more about that and understanding understanding what are the benefits to that, I would encourage people to go and visit the MSISAC's webpage for the National Cybersecurity Review. We've hosted it, I believe, almost for 10 years now. So I believe we've helped to accumulate a lot of data and to help establish a baseline of foundational understanding of the nation's cybersecurity posture to help drive policy and help to drive more resources out to the states and into the municipalities as well. So it helps to fulfill that assessment requirement for the Homeland Security Grant Program. So think of it as this is part of the process that will help to either prioritize and generate more funds that ultimately you all need. So this is just one of the steps that you can use that FEMA hosts, the Homeland Security Grant Program. So again, I think Stephanie or Seth, you might have mentioned it earlier about the grants. That's the connecting tendon, I think, in this part here is understanding what this National Cybersecurity Review is, how that feeds into the Homeland Security Grant Program, and how those funds are being distributed, I think is really ultimately left up to the state and what their priorities are.
Okay.
Thank you all for your input there on that. And we are getting to the last 10 minutes of our time together here. So I want to just open it up right now for our panelists to see if any of you have any final comments that you'd like to share with folks.
I just put in into the chat the link to the National Cybersecurity Review. It's not a long link there, but it's CIS, the Center for Internet Security. They're the organization that hosts the National Cybersecurity Review for those who are interested in learning more about it.
Thanks, Ron.
Sure.
I would say my only thing is just to say have a plan and put something on the calendar to have a conversation about it on a regular basis and do it in chunks that everybody can tolerate, and you will build over time and it will be helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd add, Wayne brought up some great points about how can we convey our message in this conversation in a way that it resonates with people, that they understand from a foundational level, what are the impacts to cybersecurity? How can, again, we help them take small bites to understand and to get them further than they were yesterday in this process of knowledge, gaining knowledge. I think that's the ultimate thing is all this is done, the Cyber Essentials is really done to help increase the knowledge base, right? Of folks. So, we appreciate feedback. I think that's the one thing, that I'm leading with here is that we appreciate the feedback. And Rain, thank you for putting this on and taking this on and, being, really proactive and, taking every piece of resource that we had available. I think we're up to chapter 5 now, publicly releasable information on the Cyber Essentials in the toolkit. But, if there's a way that we should, really start to simplify this a bit more, I think that will help us, in the longer term. Again, we like the feedback. We want to see that this is actually resonating with people out in the field. So, public and private sector engagement and feedback is always welcome, at least from my point of view. So again, thank you very much, Rain. I appreciate you hosting this and look forward to chatting more about this after this.
Thanks, Ron.
So my closing thoughts are to again, like Ron just did, to thank you, Rain, and the other councils for putting this on, and to everyone for paying attention to, as a few of us talked for, I guess, 3 hours over the course of these two workshops. There's a lot of words in there and a lot of advice and a lot of scary stuff. But just to take a step back, I think the purpose of this whole exercise was to bring to light some pretty tangible and straightforward steps that you can take now to improve cybersecurity. And so what I would say is pick whatever resonated the most with you out of these two modules and do it. Just pick one thing, pick another thing. And once you do one thing, you're more likely to go on and take the next step. There's a lot to do, but if you just start somewhere, you'll be better off and you'll notice an improvement and things will be better. There's a lot of resources in all of these modules, and just pick one thing and get going. And then make sure you get the link out of the chat that Stephanie put in there and some of these other links, because, you know, we've added some resources to what CISA has put out, and we haven't seen the final module. I don't know what's going to be in that last one. So be on the lookout for that, to have a plan. That's extremely important. But again, just pick one thing and get going. Some of this stuff doesn't need to be that complicated, and there's free and low cost tools and resources out there that are all linked and collected by DHS. So thanks for everyone for paying attention, and let us know if there are areas where there's an interest in diving in even deeper. I take Wayne's point that we perhaps maybe got a little jargony, maybe got a little too in the weeds. So we were trying not to do that. But if there's, give us some feedback and let us know what's needed. And thanks everyone for your attention.
Marian, I have just a few things. Thank
Please.
you. Thank you for this, by the way, and thanks to the fellow panelists and to all of you for listening. I think perfection is the enemy of the good. You can get started. You can do this. The fact that you're on this group today means that you're probably the ones that stand between nothing and something, and that's a good thing. You don't have to be an expert here at all. So just get started, I think. And what I love about the essentials is it really is the essentials. Like, this is the distilled wisdom of what the professionals who've been doing it 20 years think and how they think. Build the teamwork now, and you probably have allies that you don't even realize. There's cybersecurity professionals in your towns and CISOs who are around who would happily contribute their time in public service and to help, just like you get people to help with zoning, just like you get people to help with other things. The community is big in this state, and the opportunity for us to tap into that, I don't think we've even begun to tap. And I think everyone here, connect with us on LinkedIn. We will be happy to help. If you're, what do I do first, or who do I contact, or do you know anybody? I think we know people we can help with that. So thank you guys, and I think it's a great start, and you all can do really good things here.
Thank you all very much. I really appreciate all of you, our panelists, being here. It's added so much to this series to have you all just delve into these questions and really talk them through. So for people who are participating here, I just want to let you know again that the modules are available, the online training modules that we developed from the CISA Essential Toolkits that everybody has been talking about here. And they're online at all the Homeland Security Council's websites. So Allie's going to put those links directly into the chat. They're here on the screen that I'm sharing right now, but Allie will also put them into the chat so you can copy those. And we're going to follow up these webinars with an email out to everyone who has participated. We'll provide all the links that we have shared so that you'll have them in the email. And then we'll also likely be putting together a little bit of a survey to get your feedback regarding what might be some next topics that you'd like to see. And if it's okay with the panelists, I'll share your contact information in that email so that people know how to get in touch with you, because you all have put that forward that people can reach out and ask questions. So I believe that's it. Unless there's any burning questions from our audience. And otherwise, thank you all so much. And thanks to all the other Homeland Security Advisory Councils for coming together for this, and appreciate you all being here and attending. Thank you.